This presentation may initially appear to have little to do with a creation-informed response to climate change, for I'm going to attempt to explain to you the medieval roots of the modern West's dominion theology. This presents a significant explanatory challenge, but if I can explain this to you, whilst orthodox Christian theologies of creation have always opposed the pagan worship of nature, they have not always had an overtly utilitarian and power-centric approach to nature, which is characteristic of early modern dominion theologies. Indeed, the voluntarist emphasis on instrumental power over nature and the nominalist denuding of the material and the particular from the metaphysical and the universal, combined with a calculative and non-ontological understanding of knowledge itself, does not arise before the 14th century. The way we assume things are is new. It's not part of the trajectory before the 14th century in the Christian thinking. And this stance that we're familiar with only rises in Western Christendom. In contrast, Eastern Orthodox theologies of creation have always maintained continuity with patristic theologies of creation. But some 13th century Western outlooks, such as Aquinas' synthesis of Augustinian realism with Aristotelian science, are also foreign to the trends of the West from the 14th century on. Now that's controversial because, we won't go there. We'll get there as we go. To this day, Eastern Orthodoxy is richly sacramental and ontologically charged in its outlook as regards the theology of creation. Alexander Schmemann's For the Life of the World is a good recent example of the Orthodox vision of creation, which is integral with Christian sacramental essences and energies. The Eucharist is the centre of creation to Orthodox thinking. To Schmemann, the Eucharist is at the centre not only of Christian worship, but of all created reality. Here, the ontological salvific work of God through the Eucharistic liturgy of the Church is the most basic feature of reality as we experience it. The Orthodox emphasis is not on human power and human work, but on the deep spiritual realities in which the Church and the whole of creation rests. The Orthodox emphasis is on the gift of God upholding the life of the world, not on human knowledge and power. By contrast, Western dominion theology develops the idea that we are made in the decisively voluntarist image of God, where the central characteristic of God is unlimited will and absolute power. Whilst God has power over the entire universe, he has given power over the earth to us as his governing regents. However, we lost much of that power in the fall. As Peter Harrison has shown, the early modern understanding of the fall is integral with the rise of modern science. For it is the hope of 17th century natural philosophy innovators, like Francis Bacon, that Adam's sovereign power over nature can be recovered through natural knowledge. Thus, with human knowledge, we will bend nature to our will and deliver ourselves from the destructive caprice of nature. Science and technology enable us to fulfill the prelapsarian divine command to master, fill, and subdue the earth. And haven't we been good at it? From the 17th century on, as Charles Webster shows us, this voluntarist dominion understanding of creation is coupled with a distinctive technological eschatology. The advance of knowledge and the success of global travel is seen as a mark of the end of the age, paving the way for the return of Christ and the coming of the kingdom of heaven on earth. Later, this eschatology will secularise into 19th century doctrine of progress through scientific and technological advances, and of course the communist revolution. The point to notice here is that distinctive features of the Western theology of nature in the 17th century are integral with the birth of our modern scientific and technological way of life. And significantly, even after science and technology have fully separated from religion in the 20th century, our culture's natural philosophy continues to carry the dominion outlook and the eschatological vision of redemptive progress native to its theological formation. Theology has never gone away from our relationship with nature, even once we are secularised. Surprisingly then, the most pressing question regarding a creation-informed response to climate change is which creation-informed response should we take? Should we continue with a secularised dominion and technological eschatology theology of creation? Or can we find better theological resources to draw on? To address these questions, we shall need a better appreciation of the medieval backstory to the emergence of the West's early modern dominion theology. As Andrew Brown's fabulous survey of Christian creation theologies illustrates, and you should all get a copy and you won't get a better price than here, the dominant interpretive frame for scripture and theology was patristic, even in the West, via Augustine, up until the 13th century. In the 13th century, underlying cultural differences between what we might call the Latin mind and the Greek mind took on a new intellectual meaning with the introduction into the Western Christendom of Aristotle's works. At this point, we start to see an opposition between Western, more Aristotelian Christian thinking and Eastern, more Platonist Christian thinking in theological metaphysics. Significantly, there was no opposition between Platonist and Aristotelian commitments in the New Testament era, when the dominant intellectual frame of the Greco-Roman world was Middle Platonism. In the late classical era, complementarity between the two great Greek sages was further developed and harmonised by Neoplatonism, Platonists mainly. In a scripturally subordinate manner, Neoplatonist terms and ideas were taken into patristic theology in late antiquity. But partly because Plato's corpus was not recovered in the West in the 13th century, the traditional synthesis of Platonist and Aristotelian thinking under the authority of Christian sacred doctrine comes under continuous challenge from the 13th century on in the West. As Charles Schmidt points out, the high age of Aristotle in the West, unlike any time before or after, is the scholastic era from the 13th to the 17th centuries. It is also the case that Islamic theology, theological rationalism, and Islamic scientific, mathematical and philosophical learning, which was much more sophisticated than anything in the West in the early Middle Ages, were strongly influential on the West at this time. Islam, without the Trinity or the Incarnation, has a decidedly more paradox-free theology than does Christian theology, and an Islam-influenced theological rationalism became an assumed feature of Western theology at this time. Latin aphorism for anyone who's interested. A distinctive emphasis in Roman Catholic theology and metaphysics, as compared with Orthodox theology and metaphysics, is developed in the pre-modern scholastic era. Some features of the Reformation, such as Luther's Augustinian emphasis, can be seen as an attempt to return to a more Platonist theological trajectory of patristic theology, but by and large, anti-Platonist nominalism and voluntarist developments in an Aristotelian scholastic era are assumed in Protestantism as much as in Roman Catholic theology in the 16th century. Aquinas himself, a central figure at the start of the synthesis of Latin theology with Aristotelian philosophy, maintains a strong Neoplatonist metaphysics via the influence of Augustine. That is, Aquinas combines ontological realism. I notice I've used this word a couple of times and haven't explained it. On means is or being, so ontological means thinking about being. Aquinas combines the ontological realism of patristic theology with Aristotelian logic, science and ethics. When Aquinas uses Aristotelian metaphysical and theological categories, he interprets them through the lens of scripture, of patristic theology and of Neoplatonist metaphysics. Even so, the incorporation of Aristotle into Western theology was a huge intellectual upheaval, and an upheaval that coincided with the birth of the Western University in the 13th century. In the 14th century, the Franciscans instigated a decisive revolt against Aquinas' Dominican synthesis of Aristotle's corpus with the ontologically realist patristic theology. Duns Scotus and William of Ockham are key figures forging a new pathway for the Western mind. There are significant intellectual and theological reasons for these developments that we cannot explore in this presentation, but in very broad terms, the three 14th century developments that arise to prominence after Aquinas are voluntarism, nominalism, and calculative rationalism. I am persuaded that these three developments are responsible for the defective metaphysical signatures of early modern dominion theology, and that the secularisation of that theology by the 20th century is the most basic driver of the unconscionable exploitative relationship to nature that is simply assumed in technological modernity. And it is this culturally assumed mindset that I take to be the most basic cause of climate change today. Hence, if we are to have a creation-informed response to climate change that is capable of revisioning our life world towards a creator-respecting approach to the natural world, we must do a deep dive and rework most of the assumptions about nature and human knowledge and power that we have been formed in over the past 700 years. This is no easy task, but it is unavoidably pressing. Let us then look more closely at pre-modern innovations that gave rise to the early modern dominion theology of creation. Responding to the influence of Aristotle and Latin Averroism, Duns Scotus insists even more decisively on defensible logical formulations, but also defends those aspects of Christian theology that are inherently paradoxical or beyond rational sounding out in breathtakingly counterintuitive manner. Scotus' insistence on the univocity of being, that is, that the word being can be used to apply to us and to God, illustrates his move towards vigorous logical demonstration. Simultaneously, he defends the total sovereignty of the divine will, however much this might clash with our other conceptions of God that might be commonly believed. What was called Greek necessitism by its 13th century detractors is the view that Aristotelian logic, as judge and defender of Christian theology, becomes an imposed structure of rational necessity which God himself is subject to. To its detractors, Greek necessitism makes syllogistic logic an idolatrous principle above God. In some alignment with this critique, God's total sovereignty and the complete freedom of the divine will from all externally imposed constraints is solidly defended by Scotus. Scotus goes so far as to claim that moral truths are only true because God determines that they are true, which is to say, if God determined that murder was good, it would become good, for it is only the divine will that determines good. Goodness itself has no claim above God. This emphasis on the total sovereignty and unlimited freedom of the divine will is the heart of Western voluntarism. Volentus means will. Whatever God wills, God does. Whatever God wills is right and good for no other reason than because God wills it. If we impiously presume to judge that some command or act of God is not good, we must be wrong, for whatever God determines is right and just by definition. One can see how aspects of Calvinism illustrate this same stance. With reference to Rebecca, I will point out I'm saying Calvinism. I'm thinking more about 17th century Calvinism than Calvin himself. Double predestination may look unjust to us, but because God's will is sovereign, the appearance of injustice is not how things really are. If God predestines some people, or even all people, for damnation, and there is nothing they can do about it because only God's will is sovereign, then God's damnation for those who had no choice but to be the eternal wrath bearers is just. This is the Franciscan voluntarist doctrine formulation of the sovereignty of God. The traditional unity and convertibility of the Transcendentalia that is assumed in patristic and Neoplatonist inflected Christian realism, which is that wherever what is true is also good and also beautiful, so the true, the good and the beautiful are interchangeable, which is to say that you could never have a morally ugly act like murder being good. This understanding of the interchangeability of the Transcendentalia is eviscerated by the new power-centric voluntarism of the 14th century. This is one of the reasons you will never find anything like Calvinism in Eastern Orthodoxy. In the Via Moderna voluntarism, the ontological primacy of the divine will can even oppose the essential forms of the good, the beautiful and the true. This deeply shapes the West from here on in, and the categories of negative freedom, valorising the mere potency of being able to do whatever one wills, becomes integral with Western culture. This Western notion of freedom will come to shape our approach to nature and is integral with the contemporary problem of climate change. Now, I accept the term nominalism is a very broad term that includes thinkers of great variety and is not considered a useful term by specialists. Even so, I will stick with using it for the sake of brevity. Western nominalism predates the 14th century Franciscans by a couple of centuries, as one of its most powerful and earliest advocates is Peter Abelard from the 12th century. In the 12th century, Western Christendom was being born. The collapse of the Greco-Roman Imperium in the West shortly after the death of Augustine, along with the loss of classical learning, had left most of Western Europe in what we tend to call the Dark Age. But the Celtic monasteries transformed the West during the Dark Age, and when the Franks revive large domains of politically unified territory, the normal perpetual internecine war between small kingdoms settles down, economic prosperity returns, and thanks to the work of the Irish missionaries, Christendom was born. So Constantine didn't invent Christendom, it's the Irish monks. But they had very little in way of learning from the classical past. Whilst theology and philosophy, such as it was, tended to be embedded in Platonist realism, it was philosophically crude. Abelard put naive Platonist realism in his brilliant polemic Crosshairs and decimated it without much effort. Abelard's solution to the problem of universals displays his disdain for Platonist realism and gives us an excellent basic way of understanding what nominalism is. A Platonist realist holds that eternal and intangible intellective forms are realer than temporal and tangible material beings. Thus, early medieval Platonist realism held that there was such a thing as the ideal archetypal form for every type of tangible entity, such that all tables, for example, participate in the ideal supersensible form of the table with a capital T, and this ideal form was a kind of super-concrete thing in, shall we say, ontological heaven. All common nouns, which is to say all universal category types, such as table, cat, human, oak, etc., were only comprehensible to our minds because their formal essence was grasped by our mind when we saw particular instantations of these ideal universal kinds. Abelard will have none of this. Universals are only linguistic constructs. They are names only, hence the term nominalism, not expressions of real essential forms. Dispensing with early medieval realism was no great intellectual feat, but it was not a meaningful critique of the metaphysically serious Platonist understanding of intellective form. Neither did it understand a classical Platonist approach to the participation of individual beings in the transcendent qualities and essential essences that inform the material worlds. Like Andrew's saying, this stuff is incredibly sophisticated in the classical period. The early medieval period, it's pretty dumb. We cannot explore credible Platonist realism further at this point, although I've written some books about it. But it can be said that Aquinas has a metaphysically deep grasp of Augustinian Christian realism, and he represents a return to a Platonist older theology in the 13th century. However, Abelard's 12th century Via Moderna nominalism, so the Via Moderna is the modern way from the 12th century. We're all modernists because of the modern way from the 12th century. So Abelard's Via Moderna nominalism takes off in earnest again in the 14th century Franciscan William of Ockham. I can remember as a boy listening to Occam's Razor on the radio on the ABC, thinking, who is this guy? Now I know. Occam's Razor, which is do not multiply entities beyond necessity, is now taken to mean that the simplest answer is the best. But Occam called it the principle of ontological economy, and its basic point was to discard any category of meaning and intelligible essence that is not particularised and materially instantiated. This is basic to modern scientific outlooks, and it's a key driver in the demise of medieval Aristotelian notion of informed matter. To Aristotle, all natural and material beings are hylomorphic entities. That is, they are a synthesis of matter, hylo, and form, morphe. Form is intellective and makes a being a creature of a distinct essential kind, as well as conferring non-material qualities and purposes. That is, moral qualities and flourishing purposes are real features of the natural reality to Aristotle, but they become increasingly problematic for a material, particularist and nominalist vision of reality. By the 17th century, Aristotle is being discarded, and Pierre Gassendi rejects hylomorphic substances in favour of a revival of democracy and atomism. Democritus is from before Plato. Modern atomism, like its pre-classical counterpart, asserts that matter is simply material and does not carry any intellective form or purpose or meaning. Modern science is thus born nominalist and atomist and looks at nature as if it is meaningless stuff that our own minds are somehow aloof from, and stuff that is simply there for us to manipulate and impose meaning and purpose on however we see fit. The 14th century Oxford calculators embrace a universal syllogistic logic. They somewhat reductively treat nature as comprised of particular material objects that display necessary logical regularities, and they quantify physical entities through the use of mathematical logic. This Oxford way directly influenced Niccolò Erasmi and later on Galileo. The marvellously christened Richard Swineshead was one of these famous Morton College calculators at Oxford. The matters are too involved to unpack in any detail here, but I think the calculators and their impact is illuminative of the elevation of the law of non-contradiction to a universally binding metaphysical principle that would lead to theological rationalism in the 18th century on the one hand, and to a new level of mathematical abstraction in natural philosophy on the other hand. An abstract, reductive, determinist and mechanistic sensibility thus embeds itself in both scholasticism and the early modern thought world. By early modernity, even living beings are seen as machine-like entities to Descartes, and the world itself is seen as a determinate set of causal equations that can simply be solved. Once we have the right graphs, sums and mathematically framed theorems, this equips us with a true knowledge of natural necessity. This knowledge, as Francis Bacon discerned, can be used for power over nature. Medieval formation conditions give rise to the 17th century theological and natural philosophy environment. This is important to understand. For strong continuities between some medieval developments and early modernity deeply shape today's secular view of nature, of human agency, and of science and technology. In significant regards, as Bruno Latour puts it, we have never been modern. In Francis Bacon, we have a brilliant man of action who sees the natural world as given to man by God to rule. To Bacon, man has a divine right to take dominion over nature. However, the fall alienates man from his inborn knowledge of how nature works, and we need to recover this knowledge in order to rule and subdue the earth. Science, a mathematical, practical, experimental science, is thus a God-given tool which man should use to recover his rightful power over nature. Assuming atomistic nominalism, nature has no intrinsic meaning or qualitative value in itself. Assuming calculative rationalism, the world is a system of forces and energies that are determinate and interlocking, and the right use of applied mathematics will give us mechanical mastery over it. Assuming voluntarism, our humanity, as made in the image of God, is defined by the desire for total unconstrained power over the domain God has given us to rule. In other words, modern science is born in the theological womb of late medieval formed Western natural theology, where the only real point of nature is as a pool of resources for human disposal. Creation is thus nothing other than a means of enabling human utility. Nature is a theatre in which the unconstrained will and ruling power of man is to be demonstrated. I need to nuance that slightly. Okay, there's a separation. Bacon is very much into utility. The point of knowledge is human utility. However, there's still a very strong natural theology kick everywhere in the early modern period where nature reveals the glory of God. Somehow you can have these two things bubbling away together in the early modern period. As we saw in the previous lecture, the deep theologically formed origins of modern Western science secularise over time. This secularisation results in the total separation of science from religion in the late 19th century and the de-theologising of the previously eschatological function of science into an ideology of unending technological progress. Secularisation facilitates the valorisation of power over nature as an end in itself and sets us up as creators of our own destiny and our own nature. We are, as Yuval Harari prophesies, becoming Homo Deus. The lack of any God-gifted essential meaning to nature, which late medieval and early modern theological innovations facilitate, further enhances our entirely pragmatic and instrumental approach to nature in the modern era. Once Western culture loses its Christian cultural assumptions in the latter half of the 20th century, there is simply no place or need for any commonly assumed doctrine of creation. All meaning is now seen as arbitrary and generated out of human linguistic constructions, which are pasted over irrational natural desires and fears. Technology becomes the means by which we can harvest the resources of nature and turn them into profit as a means of accumulating power. Economic growth becomes the only publicly acceptable end of human social and political organisation. By the 1980s, economists like Milton Friedman are becoming the priest caste and kingmakers of the contemporary world. In our brave new post-Christendom world, technology serves profit, and we are becoming big or small wheels in the upper or lower gear system of what we now call the economy. In neoliberal economics, the market is not understood as a means of human flourishing, but is an inherently determinate and reductively material power structure. This structure is governed by the strangely amoral and non-teleological logic of financial and economic power itself. In other words, modern man, under the rubric of the free market, is now ruled by the demonic animal spirits of the bulls of greed and the bears of fear. Here, each individual is considered to be a rational, self-interested actor, pursuing the essentially irrational ends of instinct-defined instrumental power and pleasure acquisition and pain avoidance. We are now amoral and non-transcendent defined competitors for scarce power and resources. We have decreated ourselves and set up images of our own amoral power and merely natural instincts to worship. In this manner, we perform a collective idolatry and suffer the fate of those who, as the Hebrew Scriptures warn, choose death rather than life. We have become like the idols we serve, the lifeless playthings of malicious demonic powers. The scientific evidence for man-made accumulating exploitative stress on the self-balancing systems of the earth is indisputable. Natural habitat deconstruction and species extinctions are signature features of contemporary globalised consumerism. Ecologically, we are heading into territories where we do not know what kind of tipping points and instabilities will occur in the natural systems that we rely on. Could it be that secularised descendants of early modern dominion theology are the most basic cultural drivers for the environmental crisis we now face? Given the situation in which we find ourselves, and given the role of modern dominion theology has played in getting us to this place, what type of creation-informed response to climate change do we now need? Modern Western dominion theology and the secularised and post-Christian life world it has produced is defective. It is bad theology as its nature and humanity-destroying fruits have demonstrated. Which is not to say that there aren't plenty of nice things we also like about the world we live in. In contrast, the kind of creation-informed response to climate change that we need has to be grounded in good theology. Most crucially, our spiritually flattened technological life world has a profoundly inadequate metaphysics. We have no public conception of transcendent meaning or real moral truth anymore. This inadequacy is integral with the pragmatic instrumentalism of our way of life, with its functional materialism, its methodological atheism, and its entirely subjective and humanly constructed conceptions of meaning, value, and purpose. We need a theology of creation that has a rich and credible metaphysical framework supporting categories of real meaning, value, and purpose that are divinely gifted to creation rather than merely made up by us. Fortunately, significant trends in contemporary Christian creation theology have now largely abandoned modern diminutive voluntarist, nominalist, calculative dominion theology. And of course, orthodox theology has never been modern Western dominion theology of creation. The writings of Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew and Pope Francis's Laudato Si powerfully reject modern dominion theology of creation, and with excellent biblical and theological justifications. Al Gore's green evangelical theology of creation care came close to influencing US politics in the early 2000s. Celtic Christian theology of creation and Indigenous Christian theologies of creation are open to moral realism and transcendent meaning in nature. I've explored these alternatives to modern Western dominion ways of looking at creation in my book, Theology and Climate Change. Most significantly, the revival of serious metaphysical theology, questioning the 14th century voluntarist, nominalist, and calculistic turns in Western thinking, has been persuasively forwarded. There is no excuse for informed Christians to be ignorant of this ressourcement movement, radical orthodoxy, and other things like the revival of Thomistic and analogical metaphysics. The revival of non-modern metaphysical theology enables us to get back to where the original mistakes of modern Western theology were made, and enables us to find new ways forward in the present. To conclude, we have to do the hard work of undoing 700 years of theological error in our most basic ways of thinking about God's relation to creation. And we have to recover a viable way of understanding the embedding of our own knowledge and power in the Creator, if we are to be a light for the spiritual renewal of Western modernity. Without such renewal, we are pretty well doomed to destroying the conditions of natural grace which have enabled the rise of Western global modernity. There has never been a more urgent redemptive need for a viable creation-informed approach to the natural world. Thank you.